Hello, I'm Penelope Hobhouse, and I'm in my new gravel garden at Bedscombe. Last year this was all just a lawn, but then we had a very, very dry summer, and I converted it into a garden. We're very short of water here. I have to buy it from my neighbour, and she doesn't have very much. We put in a lot of grit and organic manure, and we use mainly self-seeding plants. So in a few years, anywhere you see bare gravel today, except the actual pathway, will be covered with nice, soft, flowing plants. This program is going to be about new garden ideas, about growing plants in unconventional ways, instead of growing them in ordinary flower beds and borders. It's a little bit about grasses grown in new ways, native plants, drought-resistant plants, particularly important in America where you have such hot summers. Jim Van Sweden in the United States used a lot of grasses, prairie grasses and grasses from Asia. John Brookes in Sussex uses self-seeding plants rather like I do, but he also tries to match the colours to his surrounding landscape and seasons. Here in Bedscombe we did a lot of digging and preparation for this garden, which is really for drought-resistant plants. They like to have very, very good drainage. Many of them come from the Mediterranean. Indeed, some of them come from California. This is a thistle that is called Gallictites, and it really just loves it here, and I'm hoping it's going to self-seed and make a much bigger patch next year. You know, all grey-leaved plants are drought-resistant plants because they have little hairs on their leaves which resist the hot sun. And if you look through here, you'll see how many I've got. This is a grey Lychnis. This is a silvery grey Perouskia. It's called Russian sage. And as we go on through, you see this silvery stachys here. These are all plants that really thrive in these sort of gravel conditions. And I actually love the plants as well. Here we have a very tall thistle called Onopordon arabicum. And it looks a little bit, it's been tossed by the wind here, so I've had to stake it up with some hazel twigs. It's a biennial, but it'll make a lot of seedlings, and next year they'll come up all around it, and I'll have a really big group, which is what I really want to have. Because, in fact, I would say with this garden, I'm partly experimental, and I've used a lot of plants in groups of 3s or 5s, and I think probably next year I'll increase the groups to much bigger masses, but I have to see what really does well. I've used gravel to mulch right over the soil, and that's lovely because I can walk right in without compacting the soil to do more planting or even to do a little bit of weeding if weeds do come up. The mulch conserves the moisture and also prevents weed germination. So you're always thinking about all these things as you garden, which are very important. John Brookes, the well-known international designer, is far from a conventional or traditional gardener. At his own home at Denmans in West Sussex, John has many inspirational ideas. We start our visit in the gravel garden inside the walled garden. This is divided up into a series of informal rooms made with shrub shapes and self-seeding plants making abstract patterns in the gravel. I'm with John Brookes, and we've just walked into the garden, the walled garden here, and although it's a rectangular space with brick walls, John's treated it in a very different way from the traditional English style of straight lines and borders around the edge. Can you tell me a bit about this, John?
Well, first of all, I think I ought to explain I haven't been in on it since the beginning. The garden is about 50 years old, and it was started by Joyce Robinson, who's now 93, still lives on the site, and I rather work round her. So I've picked up where she left off 15 years ago. And increasingly I find my concern and interest is more to do with texture and foliage form and shape than necessarily flower colour. Hopefully there is colour in here, and of course it comes in waves according to the season, but it's Suddenly I'm into purple foliage, I found.
I love the way you're using huge spiky foliage here and then this wonderful rhubarb rheum. The great contrast, and as you say, foliage is in a way incredibly important, isn't it?
I think about a garden really a bit like a chapter in a book, and I divide it into paragraphs and then into sentences. And so I would deal with this little paragraph almost with the odd exclamation mark of the blue seat and really work round that. So that becomes a little sort of case history on its own. And then we can go into the next little room round the urn.
Which is another
pocket. So that I think I work in pockets, radiating out from the central eye catcher.
Now, John, here's a pot with nothing in it.
Yes. It's just a nice shape.
Yes.
The point is that it's the shape of the pot contrasted with this astelia that makes a little composition.
Like
another of my exclamation marks.
Of brick all the way
We're making another little room.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to give you a breather before you go on to the next sort of watch of plants. Just plants and plants and plants and plants. It gets very tedious after a while. Occasionally you want a punctuation mark to be able to breathe. Now we're off again into the next one.
That's a very good point, I think. It's an excellent point. You just need... It's like saying you want a bit of shade to walk through before coming out in sunlight again.
Absolutely.
And now, John, we're arriving at another of your little pockets. It's like a hidden compartment, isn't it?
Yes, this is broadly herbs, whose texture and whose sort of cuddliness I love, all these little round mounds.
That they're aromatic,
you really can. I use quite a lot of gold foliages, and of course you get that in the marjoram and the sages with that robinia behind, but then I think that goes terribly well with the lemon and these green, acid green flowers of alchemilla. So I use a lot of that as a sort of basis in a way.
And it's really a sort of cottage style, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think it's the cottage garden tradition that can tell us so much more about this softer, gentler, wilder way.
I think that you are teaching people to see that you can do these rather naturalistic forms and keep it well, and then every now and then have these, I mean, you have these very strong structural plants, but not arranged in straight rows. My temptation is to be much more traditional, and when I get to a gateway, I put a pair of plants or two groups of plants on either side, and I notice with you, you're just so much braver that you have thistles here and viburnums here. I'm much too busy framing everything or making it symmetrical and architectural, and I think you've such a lot to teach, well, not only me obviously, but everybody, and just looking back at the shapes, the free shapes, contrasting with the round ones.
Well, thank you. But my feeling is that we've moved away from this classic inference of the left hand having to balance the right. We do know about abstraction and asymmetry now, and we ought to be using it with our plants and in our garden sort of layouts, that they have to move along. We can't go on doing this 18th century gracious living bit. Life isn't like that now.
And now we're into a very different part of the garden, John, filled with abstract shapes, the lawn that's like sort of scrolls, and then this is your dry riverbed.
This is Joyce's dry riverbed, which I've tampered with over the years, of course, and reshaped. But here things are planted to create this sort of wild effect. In a way, I don't plant it, I edit it out. And I think that's the great difference between what I call restrictive gardening of the Edwardian gardener, where all clipping, edging, lopping, pruning, spraying. And here we're beginning to learn to manage a landscape, manage what happens naturally, but pushing it along a little bit.
I think the word editing is very useful, don't you?
Yes,
because you're letting it happen. Are we allowed to walk here?
Yes, as long as you don't get your feet wet.
This is really a bridge. But we have to do a bit of...
And you have to leap on the rocks.
Onto the rock. Okay.
You see that here all these verbascums have just self-seeded themselves. Well, after rain, I can pull a lot of them out, pop them on, or use them somewhere else.
Yes, but next year you will have spikes here, and you may not have spikes there.
Oh,
they will be babies.
So it changes.
So it changes, yes, all the time. And now we're in a really slightly wilder part of the garden, but with quite domestic orchards, and I begin to see a glint of real water beyond.
Yes, the dry stream wanders down and ends in this pool. I use different lengths of grass here. This gets cut weekly with a cylinder mower, and that with a rotary about once a month. It has bulbs in it in the spring and wild flowers. It cuts down on maintenance is what it's all about.
And now
Yes.
you're using here really water-loving plants. We've moved from the drought habitat
Yes.
to the moisture.
Really, with all this sort of muddy bit at the back, and I enjoy these big leaf things that you tend to get in moist ground very much indeed. Of course, nature does it. I set it up, and then the way it matures is all to do with nature, and that really is the key, I think, to the whole of this newer type of wilder way gardening. It's a sort of distillation of the country technique, I think.
But with you doing this very careful editing all the time, you let things happen, and yet you can control the
Yes.
shapes, because in the end you're painting this picture.
Right. And everybody will do it their own way, depending
Yes.
where they are in the world, really.
Yes. Well, John, thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
Penny, it was
Nor-
lovely.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you. Wolfgang Oehme and Jim Van Sweden are American designers working from Washington. They're so well known they don't really need an introduction from me, but they have really transformed the face of Washington. Instead of foundation planting, they've used wonderful grasses and perennials, and they've given a new look to American cities and freeways all over the country. They also do private gardens, spring bulbs, prairie grasses, the same summer perennials in abstract patterns, very much like the sort of thing that Burle Marx used to do in Brazil. Jim has designed a magnificent estate on Chesapeake Bay in Maryland.
This is the private garden of Corbin Gwaltney on the western shore of Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. As you see, you're looking here at the front garden, actually, which is planted as a metaphor for the American meadow. There's no lawn here, and you can see that the plants are used in great masses, and it's actually a rather simple plant list, but it's the way they're planted as a kind of tapestry on the ground plane. There's not a border here in the sense that plants are, it's a collection, or they're planted as a collection in a border, but it's a great mass and meadow-like. This house has no front lawn, very unusual in the American scene. Normally we have a front garden that has lawn and then the traditional shrubs piled against the base of the house. But here the planting actually moves out from the base of the house right out into the front, and there is no lawn to relate to the public space of the street, for instance. Penny, as you know, Wolfgang Oehme and I really pioneered the use of ornamental grasses in the United States, and it's spreading to other parts of the world now too. But look how beautifully they are moving in the wind here, the wonderful light on them, the sheen of the leaves, and then the differences in texture. This miscanthus, for instance, has a very large, broad leaf, while the pennisetum, or fountain grass here in the foreground, used in a huge mass again, is very fine in texture and wonderful in the wind. We have terrible storms here on Chesapeake Bay, hurricanes with winds of 100 miles, 110 miles an hour. And these grasses simply lie down, and then after the storm is over, they stand right back up again. I think it's important to emphasize, again, that they have to be used in large areas and in combination with various shapes and forms. For instance, this wheat-like flower of Calamagrostis blooms early. It actually starts blooming in June. It's the first grass to bloom, and it keeps this blossom throughout the entire winter until it's cut down at the end of winter in early March. It's a magical kind of look, perfect in wind, and wonderful as it changes in the seasons to gold. Our work is often compared to that of the great Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Burle Marx, and he worked in Rio and actually considered his work paintings on the ground plane. Of course, he was working with tropical plants, and we're working with deciduous plants here in Zone 7. You'll notice also that we have used plants here like he did in great masses. This Nepeta, for instance, is used in a large mass. And then the sweeping curves are very important. For instance, look how this sensuous curve relates the planting area and edges it and to the lawn, which then picks up the design on the right here. We use lawn for specific reasons, in this case to tie the house visually to the bay. And you can see this is a very large lawn. And now let me show you a little trick. What happened to the lawn? Well, you can see that it's foreshortened in this expansive view from the house to the bay. We used it as an intermediate plane between the pool deck, which we're standing on here, and the water of the bay itself, the water level. You'll also notice that we use the pool to bring the bay and the sky right up to the house, right up to the windows of the library. And the simplicity of the view, I think, is also very important here. Notice how only the column of grasses there at the far side of the pool is used to break the edge of lawn and water, and also to keep you from feeling that you're going to fall off the edge of the deck visually. I hope that this garden illustrates a kind of simple design that can be used in gardens across the United States and will have an influence on our American garden scene.
Jim Van Sweden's influence on the American garden scene spreads to private and public gardens. There are exciting changes going on in American gardening. Above all, you can go to public gardens, parks in cities and botanical gardens to learn about new ideas. Lyndon Miller only designs for public spaces. She has transformed some of New York's parks and squares from areas of trash and vandalism to peace and tranquility.
Evening is a lovely time to be in any garden, your own garden, or here in the public garden at the New York Botanical Garden. I love working in public gardens. I'm lucky enough as a painter to be out here working with plants instead of in a studio, as I did happily for many years. I like doing these public gardens because they seem to mean so much to other people. They come to these places from all over the world. They're speaking all different languages, and they respond to the fact that it's been made beautiful for them. And they don't step on things, they don't throw their trash around, they love them. And they come up to me, sometimes with tears in their eyes, to tell me how wonderful these places are and how much they mean to them. And that's why I don't do private gardens. I only do public gardens. I know Penny understands that with me, at how terribly important these places are. As more and more of us live in cities and have more and more stress in our lives, places like this wonderful public New York Botanical Garden become more and more important to us all.
I'm back in my gravel garden at Bettiscombe. This is my new garden, and we've done it all very quickly, really in this one spring. And the plants look very happy. And of course, next year it's going to look rather different, because the perennials will be more ebullient and bigger and stronger, and the biennials and annuals will have seeded. And they will have seeded probably in pockets more or less where they are, but I'll have to do a lot of editing then to make sure that I've got the pattern I want. This is Brian Gray, who helps me in the garden, and it's Brian who's really done all the work for getting this gravel garden ready. Very heavy work, Brian, too. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did, first of all for the path and then for the beds?
Well, we had a problem here with the path. We had to take the soil out to start with, and then we had to lay down what is called a hogging. It's rather coarse sand with rather large stones in that sand, and then there's like a sandwich of soil in between this and the
so
coastal
that the
stone.
seedlings, when they get down into this, have something to grow in.
Yes.
And it really does look wonderful. And the other thing that's great about it is that the weeds come out very easily when you do get the unwanted plants, which does actually even happen here. And then what did you do exactly for the beds?
Well, that was rather more difficult, actually, because when we think about the clay that we have here, obviously you couldn't have these sort of plants in the clay. We had to take all the soil away. We had to take it out by a wheelbarrow. There's no other entrance, and replace really with soil, mushroom compost and grit, all mixed up together, very sharp grit. So you've got the drainage and, of course, the help for the plants.
Well, thank you, Brian, very much indeed, and of course for all your hard work.
Thank
If you're thinking of changing your garden because there's too much maintenance, you want to save water in watering those endless lawns, or you want to try and grow native plants which are really adapted to your own neighborhood, you can do that. You should always try and keep your mind open. For me, this gravel garden was really a new idea, and I think before I did it, I was really in a rut and only making traditional gardens, and that's what I might easily have done here. Goodbye until next time. Hello, I'm Penelope Hobhouse, and I'm in my potting shed at Beddiscombe. And when I first started gardening in the 1950s, plants used all to come from nurseries bare-rooted, and you could really only plant in the spring and in the autumn. Nowadays we get everything in plastic containers, and if we don't get them like that, we get them with their roots balled up and wrapped in sacking. We call it balled and burlapped. And of course it means that the little fibrous roots in the compost, the soil isn't lost from those roots when you plant, so the plant gets very much less disturbance and can keep on growing. It's ideal, really it's ideal. So now we can plant at any time of the year, except of course when the ground is frozen or if it's too hot in summer. If it's too hot, plants really stop growing, and it's better to put them away in the shade and leave them till the weather cools. Here I planted much of my gravel garden in May and June because it's completely new, and I was still planting as late as that in the spring. These are plants that I'm going to put in now in July. Some are biennials, like this Angelica, and that will flower for me next year. So I have to get it in now while the soil is warm. Others are perennials, like some of these grasses, that will really start performing next July. You always have to think a year ahead in gardening. This is one I brought back from Greece, but it's really a plant from South America. It only is a biennial, so I'm keeping it in a pot for this summer to make it flower quickly so I can get plenty of seed for next year. This is a perennial. It's a really beautiful thistly plant. It's an eryngium. And I was given this, and I'm going to keep this one plant in a pot till I've got seed in exactly the same way, and then I shall sow it next spring. As gardeners, we're all plant collectors at heart. We're always on the lookout for rare plants, partly because we want to have plants in our garden that nobody else has. Luckily for us, both here and in the United States, there are many small specialist nurseries where we can find these new and exciting plants. Sometimes they've been collected for seed from abroad by the nurserymen. They go in the winter to Asia, South America, Mexico, still bringing in new plants even today. Other nurseries do breeding, and they're breeding really to improve our garden plants, make them more garden worthy. Sometimes to make plants have shorter stems so they don't need staking, longer periods of bloom. Some plants can be made to be bred for increased hardiness for the colder areas, or even more able to withstand very hot summers and hot nights in Southern America. Nurserymen are a vital link between the botanist, the plant collector, and the gardener. And there are three great ages of plant discovery, each of which in its own way affected the styles of how we garden. The first one began at the end of the 16th century, when all sorts of bulbs and corms and rhizomes were introduced from the far east end of the Mediterranean nearly all plants that love to have baking sun in the summer. The next great age of plant discovery was finding out about American plants. And it was really your John Bartram who started the first botanic garden in America in the early part of the 18th century. And he sent many woody plants and perennials from your very rich flora to England and to Europe. And I think this influenced the whole development of the English landscape movement, because the French and Italian styles had used very controlled and clipped plants. Now, in the 18th century, the English wanted to experiment with all these new specimens. The very next big age of discovery was towards the end of the 19th century. And then the collectors were able to at last explore the countries of the Far East, Japan and China. And the plants there played a very important role in a new sort of bog and moisture gardening. In Victorian times, head gardeners working with huge teams of men had enormous power and influence. The garden at West Dean, the walled garden at West Dean, has been newly restored and all the greenhouses brought completely up to date. Jim Buckland is the head gardener there today, and he grows collections of plants all inside this strong historical context of these restored gardens. So it's off to West Dean. I'm in the wall garden at West Dean, and this is what you call the frame yard, Jim. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And this is the greenhouse area with all your frames and your pit houses and all that. And you've been responsible for restoring all of this in the last, what, 3 or 4 years?
Really over, 3.5 to 4 years. Yeah, we got the go-ahead from the trustees 4 years ago.
And it's really one of the most exciting restorations in England, because nobody else has tackled a Victorian garden of this sort, have they?
Not really, not on with the range of glass and perhaps to the complexity that we've gone into it. And we were in the fortunate position that we're part of the Edward James Foundation. And the Edward James Foundation is all about conservation and education. So we could put together a very good case for carrying out a restoration of the wall garden back to its former glory, on the basis that A, we'd be conserving the historic fabric of the place, the buildings and the walls, etc. And then secondly, we'd be creating a gently educational experience for the visiting public of what it was like to actually be in this walled kitchen garden at the turn of the century. And of course,
and providing the opportunity to recollect the plants that were grown in Victorian times.
Indeed, because what you've got to remember is that the walled kitchen garden was the powerhouse, the boiler room for the whole of the great country house garden. And the country house garden was sort of the nodal point for lots of stuff that was coming in from all over the empire during the 19th century. And the head gardener was, in those days, unlike now of course, a very powerful person.
Yes.
And he would have been avaricious for those plants coming in from all over the world.
So these gardens were partly collections, vegetables, flowers, bulbs,
functional,
rare things.
but also collections, yeah.
Yes. One of the things that strikes me coming here is how healthy everything looks and how very, very well looked after. I mean, part of the fact there's no weeds at all, but clean and healthy greenhouses.
My picture of the Victorians was that they were a very dynamic, very energetic people, and they would want the best, and that no Victorian head gardener would allow the garden to look scruffy, and neither would his owner, because it was a source of great status and pride for the owner.
I mean, in those days, the owner would have brought his lunchtime guests
That's
round.
right, yeah.
So who is at the public now?
Well,
Who are
yeah, actually
allowed to-
until now, our Lord and Lady are in fact Joe Public
Yes.
and Mrs. Joe
Yes.
Public, and that's a great pleasure. We get a great deal of satisfaction
Yes,
from people
and
coming
people
round
are
and
very
enjoying it,
interested.
and they respond
Yes.
to it,
Yes.
which is lovely.
Well, I think it's very exciting. I hope I can come back again and see it. Thank you
Indeed.
very
Watch it
much.
over the years.
Indeed. Yes, I'd like to watch it develop, the fruit trees growing.
Thank you.
Jim's wife, Sara Wain, also is a collector, and she collects fruits, vegetables and flowers from all over the world. And she grows them in the traditional 19th century methods in the restored greenhouses. Well, I'm in one of Sarah's greenhouses now, and she's really got to tell me all about what she grows in them. What is this bit? Sara.
This one, Penny's called the Orchard House. These are peaches on the back wall, and these are all fruit trees in pots.
This looks like a nectarine.
That's right.
Which is just coming on.
And cherries further back, and more peaches as well. Different varieties. A lot of them are Victorian varieties.
And Sara, you've really become, it seems to me, not just an expert in growing, but really a collector.
Well,
of
yes, that's
fruit
right.
And vegetables.
Yes, flowers.
Flowers, everything.
Yes.
You would call yourself almost a collector. Or are
Yeah,
you thinking
it's
about
one way
food
of looking
first?
at it.
I love your old tools too.
Yes.
What a nice feature for visitors as they come through to see. But it's so
Forward.
lovely to see things that are not made in plastic, isn't
No,
it?
that's right.
Gives one a great sort of aesthetic pleasure,
And
really.
some of them look lethal as well to use.
I'm sure they were. Sara, we really are coming now into your tomato house, but this is only a part of your whole collection.
That's right. I've got them growing outside as well because I want to see how well they do outside, and I have another house where I'm training them up as well, just
You
to see.
should do pretty well if this weather goes on.
They're doing extremely well this year. I'm very pleased with them, and the fruit's not splitting as well.
So tell us about some of these. What is this amazing
This
one?
one's called watermelon beefsteak. It's this rather large, pinky fleshed.
Beautiful pinky
tomato.
colour, isn't it?
Tastes
It's
delicious.
lovely.
But I particularly like this one. Unfortunately, it's not in its true colouring, but it becomes orange-yellow when it matures, and it's called Old Flame. And there's a very bizarre one up there called Black, which looks like a festering bruise. A bit grim on the table, I think, or in a mixed salad.
And Sara, is it like wine tasting, that if we put you at a table and made you taste all of these, you could tell us the name? Yes.
No, I could probably tell you one like this seedless grape. They later in the season they become really, really sweet and they're delicious. I love them. I do like the salad effect too, where you have yellow, green, and red tomatoes all
They
together.
look so beautiful.
They do. They look
And
like
these
jewels.
are all very old ones that you've been collecting.
Mostly, yes, and a lot from America actually. They're heirloom varieties and what we call heritage varieties in England. So
called
combination.
heirloom.
That's right,
There.
same thing. But I like them even when they're not in colour.
I
I
think
mean, that's great,
beautiful
isn't
with the
it?
greens.
Yes, yeah.
Is it true that when tomatoes were first introduced from the New World that people thought they were poisonous?
It
and
is
didn't eat
true,
them?
yes.
How long did that last?
I don't know. This is an orange one.
Yeah.
That's called mini orange. There, that's also
beautiful
from
too.
America.
I think I
Italian
rather
tomato.
agree with you. I love them when they're green, these lovely shades
Great
of
to
green.
paint like that,
Yes.
if you're an artist.
Be nice. It would be nice. Tell me about your ornamental gourds, because you don't eat these at all.
No, these are grown purely for decorative purposes. And I'm growing the large fruit and variety this year. I had the smaller ones last year. The beauty of this house for these type of plants is that the fruit hang down below the leaves and show off very well. It
Wonderful.
really looks
and then
good.
you cut them and can keep them till Christmas or
Yes,
later.
they're wonderful decorations as well.
They're
Yes,
so
they're really
beautiful,
good.
I think.
Yeah.
Well, Sara, then what else are you going to start collecting?
Heavens knows, I don't know. Aubergine. I've got 12 so far. I'd really like to
That
get a
sounds
lot more
very few.
aubergine. Yes, it's really, yes.
I'm in Wendy Perry's nursery at Bosvigo, and I love coming here because, in fact, I bought a lot of my plants for my new gravel garden in her nursery in the spring, and they've done very well. And one of the things about Wendy's nursery is, although it's early August and a lot of perennials in beds, let alone pots, are beginning to look tired, here they all look very fresh and well. And if you visit here, you can go round the garden and see the plants, mature plants, the parent plants of these ones that she is offering in pots. And that means that you know the sort of way plants are going to behave and give you an idea how to use them. At Hadspen, Nori Pope is also a nurseryman, but he is a plant breeder as well. And I think one of the reasons why he and his wife started doing the nursery tour was because they were looking for different colour nuances for their main borders. And he breeds perennials and annuals just to get those extra tints or shades or tones of flower colour that he can use in his great colour compositions.
Hi, I'm Nori Pope, and we're in the Hadspen Garden, the old kitchen garden, which was derelict when my wife and I came in 1987 from Western Canada, from Vancouver Island, where if anything's older than 20 years old, it's an ancient monument. So seeing walls that were older, 300 years old when Canada first became a country, it's pretty romantic and exciting. When we first came here, we searched nurseries to find plants for our planting palette. And if we couldn't find them, we had to breed them, make them for the individual spots. Sometimes people, like this puppy here, they gave us a dark seed head of the Papaver somniferans, and it turned out quite dark, but not quite dark enough. So we seeded a lot and selected out darker and darker forms. Also lighter and lighter forms. As we go up the border, the colors get lighter. That Astrantia Hadspen blood, was also bred for this part in the border, and that's a plant that didn't exist before. Now there's many varieties of this on the market, but that was the first one. We can go into the back of the nursery now, and where all the work takes place. That's quite fun back there, one of my favorite parts in the nursery. As you can see, this is the area, this is the kind of workhorse of the nursery and of the garden. This is where the plants are made to supply the garden, and also what we can do back here is to play around with many, many different cultivars. Great advantage about having a nursery is you have a good excuse to have every plant that's available, and these days a huge number of the plants are available, more than ever before in history. A plant like this, Regersea pinnata here, is a good example of one of the things that you can do in a nursery and a garden like this. We have the national collection of this plant, and which means we have all of those cultivars that will grow in the northern temperate zone, which means all of them because they're very hardy plants. Many other gardens have other genotypes that they're protecting, but we have all of the Regerseas, big herbaceous plants. It's great fun. And then you get to know about them. It's not something that I particularly was enthusiastic to begin with, but the more I know it, the more I like it, and the more valued it is. Some plants, like this Sambucus, we developed for their yellow leaves. Even though it's like to become a tree, we treat it as a herbaceous plant. That is, we cut it to the ground. This particular chartreuse color I'm fond of, and have developed a Dicentra spectabilis called Goldheart. We've even made a section of the border for this. Sometimes we develop plants specifically for a border and change the color of the plant to fit the border. In this case, we've made a border to fit the color of the plant. We were the last people to have that particular lupin called Thundercloud, which is a Victorian form of lupin. Beautiful, sort of well-named, slaty purple lupin. Many other lupins have been bred from that, but we almost lost the genotype. No one else had thought to propagate it, just it was out of fashion, and we happened to have this section in the border which we had been propagating for ourselves because we liked the color. We didn't know it had been lost to cultivation, of course, until we were contacted by Wisley and asking for a piece of it back. Here we have a plant that was sent to us by a Dutch nurseryman, an achillea called Walter Funch. There's this friend, Piet Oudolf, who has a nursery in Holland, sent us this, or gave us this when he came, rather, that to fit in particularly to our orange border. And this happens all the time now, because these borders are established. People bring plants and they say, oh, you must have this exactly suits what you're doing, which is great for us because it saves us having to breed them or looking at them. For the public, we organize these plants in our nursery in color. Every section of the nursery has its own color, from white and yellow together, then blue, and then pink, dark reds and plums, and then the apricot section. All of the shade plants are kept separately alongside of the wall. Once somebody came and bought a whole section of the blue section, just laid it out as it was in the nursery, which was great fun. I thought it was an appalling idea, but he came back later, a couple of years later, and said how well it had worked, so it must have been all right. One of the things about having a nursery like this, And a garden like Hadspen is people come expecting to be educated, and hopefully they do learn something. But one of the spin-offs of that is that we learn an enormous amount from our customers. They seem to have so much knowledge about so many things, and we learn at least as much as they do.
When you get a plant in a nursery, I think it's very important to think about where that plant comes from. If you don't know that, you won't really know the sort of conditions the plant wants. And the other thing is, I'm very interested in the history of plant introductions, so you should spare a thought for all those amazing, intrepid explorers and collectors who brought plants in that we now grow in our gardens. John Brookes the younger in the early 17th century travelled to Virginia and brought back quite a few of your very good American plants for use in our gardens in England and also in France. And on those voyages, they were so short of water that he used to give up his own ration to keep the plants going. And he discovered that if he stuck cuttings of plants in raw potatoes, they might last through the voyage. And remember, potatoes were also very new plants in early 17th century England. But it's the nurserymen who make it possible for us to grow such a variety of different plants in our gardens. We can be plant collectors ourselves thanks to them. They propagate, they identify, they label, and they put things in convenient containers so that actually we can plant at any time of year as well. Thank you. Goodbye. I hope to see you next time.